started. Good afternoon, and oops, can you hear me?
Yep.
So I'm Jane Vossler, and it's nice to see you all here today, and I welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center and the Richmond Historical Society. And I'd like to introduce Rowley Brucken. We're very happy to have him with us. This is a Vermont Humanities Council program. They have helped us with the funding for it. And Rowley's a history professor at Norwich University. He specializes in international human rights law and the Cold War foreign policy. And he's written a book called A Most Uncertain Crusade, The United States, the United Nations, and Human Rights, 1941 to 1953. So I'll turn it over to you, Rowley, and you can say more about yourself if you want, whatever.
I don't like to talk about myself. I'd much rather actually ask questions than answer them, because then you don't have to answer them if you're the one asking questions. A secret I've learned with teaching over the years. But I want to thank Jane and the Community Senior Center for hosting this talk and for inviting me to give it on restorative justice in Argentina, Rwanda, and Vermont. And you might think that those countries don't, or states don't share many things in common, but I'll try to convince you otherwise in terms of a common need to deal with crime and wrongdoing, and especially serve victims of crime and other wrongdoing. And I'd like to start out by lighting a candle, which I'll do here. And I'll tell you why in just a sec. So my entry into restorative justice really was back in 1997 when I was part of a conference in Detroit with Amnesty International. I'm still a volunteer with AI. And I met a woman named Clementine Barfield, who had founded a group in Detroit called Save Our Sons and Daughters, or So Sad. And she founded this organization because her two sons were killed in a drive-by shooting. And she met with us, a group of Amnesty volunteers and staff, because she opposed capital punishment, as did Amnesty. And we talked about how to work toward the abolition of capital punishment in the Midwest, because although she had suffered the deaths of her two sons, she wanted violence to stop there. And she and I had such a powerful conversation. And so I light this candle for her sons, and for all victims of violence, whether they are alive or not. Before I talk about restorative justice. Let me share my screen, which means I won't be able to see any of you. So feel free to interrupt if you'd like to clarify. I do want to have time at the end for discussion and questions. So. Okay. Can folks see my screen okay?
Yes.
The title slide? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So here's a general outline. And I come at this topic through three different lenses. One is as an academic, as Jane mentioned, historian of international human rights law. And the more that I uncovered the origins of this modern day notion of international human rights law that dates from World War II, the more ineffective I saw that it was actually actual to people on the ground, to real victims. Because political power, national sovereignty, principles of domestic jurisdiction really prevent human rights violators from being held accountable, whether for torture, whether for crimes against humanity, whether for mass rape or war crimes, international humanitarian law, that whether national governments or international entities refused or could not hold those folks accountable. So one entryway is as a skeptical academic. A second entryway into this topic is as a Zimbabwe specialist with Amnesty International USA. I've been their Zimbabwe specialist for 15 years, and that involves doing a number of things. But one thing that's relevant to this is to testify in political asylum cases involving Zimbabwean nationals in the United States. So if a Zimbabwean comes to the United States, claims political asylum, has a lawyer, and that lawyer knows how to contact me on various listservs, I can serve as an expert witness in terms of general country conditions in Zimbabwe, as well as try to verify details of their story. And so I've met with in this capacity, 45 victims who have suffered tremendous trauma of very, very different kinds by the Zimbabwean government and its military and police entities. And that's been a very powerful process involved with talking with them about what happened and then coming up with evidence that their story is indeed accurate to the best that I can verify specific details. And the third entryway into this is as a restorative justice activist. I started out with the National Presbyterian Church in the late 90s. And from there, when I moved to Vermont in 2001, got involved with the creation of the community justice centers in Montpelier and Barrie. And I've served on the Northfield Reparative Board for the last almost 20 years now. And that's given me a hands-on local and statewide view of restorative justice and its strengths and weaknesses. So those are the three lenses. And what I'd like to do in this presentation, and we'll go pretty quickly. So just because of the time period that I want to save for questions, we'll look at three key restorative justice principles for those that aren't familiar with the concept, and then look at how Argentina, Rwanda, and Vermont have wrestled with those key principles, and especially the needs that victims have of violent crime, the common needs, as diverse as victims are, the common needs that victims tend to have, and then conclude with some general impressions for another country that I work on, which is Zimbabwe, and then take some general questions. So restorative justice principles. There are three main principles of restorative justice. They're somewhat embodied in the diagram on the top left. The table on the right has to do with, there's one mention of school, but it's in general for restorative justice processes in general, as opposed to a traditional approach that is focused on trials and punishment. So the first main principle of restorative justice is that unlike trials that focus on the offender, restorative justice really focuses on the victim and asks the question, who was harmed? Meaning not just the direct victim, for example, someone who was a victim of burglary or a property crime, but also who is harmed in a more general sense. For example, the community, as vague a concept as that is often harmed because people feel less safe after crime has been committed. Or if they've witnessed the crime personally, they might feel traumatized in some way. So there are direct victims and indirect victims, and restorative justice seems to identify and meet the needs of both. A second principle of restorative justice is on the offender. Restorative justice still focuses on the offender and seeks to identify why the offender did what he or she did and what those needs are to prevent the offender from committing the same offense again and to pay back, to restore the relationships that the offender has caused to break or to fray with the larger community and the immediate victim. And the third principle of restorative justice is a flexible process. Unlike trials that have specific rules of evidence and strive for consistency, restorative justice strives for a flexible process that identifies and meets the needs of victims, offenders, and communities. So it could look the process itself could look pretty different depending on the context and the case and the people involved. So justice means identifying in a restorative context, again, first focusing on the needs of victims. And you see in the bottom left, I've identified the needs of victims as being 6 A's. So whether you're a victim of a terribly violent crime or a property crime or something that's less violent in terms of physical safety, victims in general have these kind of 6 main needs. First, foremost, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, safety. Acquiring safety for victims is the primary need. In fact, victims who do not feel safe should not participate in the restorative process because that's first and foremost necessary. Second is an audience. And by audience, I don't mean a large group of people. You can have an audience of one, but a trusted person or a small group of people that the victim feels comfortable talking and unburdening himself or herself about what happened, to talk about what it was in the moment and what questions they have after the fact. The third A is when victims are ready to be able to ask questions of the offender, because victims tend to blame themselves for what happened. I was in the wrong place. I didn't take precautionary measures. I shouldn't have done A, B, or C. And by asking questions, the focus shifts to what the offender what the victim thinks they're responsible for to the offender. So to ask questions of the offender, why did you choose me? What were you thinking? Was I a random target or was I deliberately chosen? Was there much premeditation or was I a victim of opportunity? Asking questions. Third, accountability. Victims want to see the offender be held accountable, to acknowledge what they did and to take steps to compensate for what they did. Fifth, an apology. Many victims want an apology from the offender, not a forced apology and not an insincere apology, but when the offender is ready and willing to make an apology that specifically says what the offender is apologetic for or sorry for and why. And finally, access to reparations. And when we talk about reparations, oftentimes that's reduced to money. It's been my experience with talking with victims in Vermont and internationally, money is far down on the list. Reparations, depending on the context, might be some kind of memorial for if someone has passed away, for the death of their loved ones. It might be a tombstone. It might be the naming of a park or a memorial named after someone famous who they were connected to who's no longer with us. Reparations could be, in the case of burglary, restoring the item stolen. It could be, if it's vandalism, repainting the side of the house that was defaced. So reparations are not reduced to money necessarily and could be very symbolic. With those 6 A's and that general overview of restorative justice, let's see how they apply to 3 places that seem very dissimilar: Argentina, Rwanda, and Vermont. So in Argentina, in 1976, the military seized power. And from 1976 to 1983, when that military government ceded to an elected government, in that 7-year period, between 10,000 and 30,000 Argentinians disappeared. Now, that's an atrocious disparity, 10,000 to 30,000. And that gets to the poem that is on the link that George put up. It's called Mr. Cogito on the Need for Precision. It's a poem by Zbigniew Herbert, who was a Polish dissident during the Cold War. And the poem talks about, in many cases, we know exactly how many people perish. For example, in an airplane crash. Pretty clear from the passenger manifest, if all are killed, how many and their names. But then we go to natural disasters, especially in underdeveloped countries, where not only the names might not be known, but there's a wide disparity in terms of the number of people who disappear. And then the final part of the poem is about those who perish in struggle with their governments, including disappearances. And the last 2 lines of the poem always struck me from the moment I came across this when I was a teenager. The last 2 lines: ignorance about those who have disappeared undermines the reality of the world. So think about someone that you love very deeply, and one day you never see them again, and you have no idea what happened to them, who took them, under what circumstances, and what happened to them. Were they kept alive for a while? Were they killed right away? How did they die? Where are their bodies? Ignorance about those who have disappeared undermines the reality of the world. So this mafia system that was called the Argentinian government, military government, that made perhaps up to 30,000 disappear. After the invasion of the Falkland, they invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982, and the British ejected them. The government fell, and there were elections held, and Prime Minister Raúl Alfonsín won elections in 1983. And 5 days after taking office, he did something incredibly brave. He created CONADEP, and you can see the name in Spanish, in English, the National Commission on the Disappeared. And this was a group of 10 people, well-respected, chaired by novelist Ernesto Sabato. It's the first such truth commission in the world. Truth Commission. What do I mean by that? Well, the job of this commission was to investigate what happened to however many people disappeared they could find and document. And the military wielded power behind the scenes. So in the debate over creating this commission had substantial impact in terms of limiting the commission's effectiveness before it even began. So the commission was not allowed to subpoena any official documents and was not allowed to subpoena members of the military to testify. And also, there were no public hearings allowed because the military did not want to be impugned, the reputation of the military impugned on TV. So instead, the commission members traveled around Argentina and took over 7,000 statements from victims and psychologists and social workers. And that created 50,000 pages of testimony of individuals saying, my son, my daughter, my father, my mother, my husband, my wife, here are the circumstances under which I last saw them. And here are some rumors I may have heard about them. In 1984, the next year, the commission published its report called Nunca Más, or Never Again. It immediately became a bestseller. It listed in a confidential appendix 1,300 names of perpetrators in the military, high and low-ranking military members who were allegedly responsible for these disappearances. It was supposed to be confidential. That was another agreement made to the military. It was quickly leaked to the newspapers and the names were published. The military was not too pleased. We'll see what the military does in response to that. But Nunca Más sold 40,000 copies on its first day. By 2007, was probably the best-selling book in the nation's history after the Bible at 500,000 copies. And it documented 8,960 people, names and some circumstances of those who had disappeared, and identified the location of 365 torture centers scheduled around the country. There was such an outcry initially that the military ceded space to allow for the trials of 5 leading military members, including members of the military junta. The 3 main leaders of the military during the 7-year period stood trial. But that was it. That was it. The military then said, after these 5 trials, that's it, and forced the Argentinian Congress, under the threat of a coup, to pass amnesty laws that prevented any further trials, any further convictions, and shut down then any trials that had been in process. So the Argentinian government, still under Alfonsin and then Carlos Menem, began what were called truth trials as a sort of halfway step to try to address the needs of victims to find out what happened, but also to respect the military's desire that there be no real fact-finding that could hurt the military's reputation. And under these truth trials that began in 2000, state prosecutors were allowed to investigate and gather information about the disappearances of specific people, but there would be no one held accountable. So think of these as investigations rather than trials, because there was no accountability, but the state prosecutors were allowed to subpoena and gather evidence and publish the story that they had. But there would be no participation by the military, and if somebody was alleged to have been implicated in a disappearance or a murder or a rape, they would not be actually tried. By 2005, there had been such distance from the military junta. Civilian government had much more of a stable standing, and the Argentinian public had gotten very tired of military stonewalling, that both Congress and the Argentinian Supreme Court invalidated the amnesties. And so trials were allowed to proceed. And from 2005 to 2019, there were 3,100 people charged with crimes dating from the Dirty War, this period of military junta. There were 900 convictions, and there are several hundred cases that were still ongoing as of the end of 2019. 130 children were also reunited with their families. They had been taken by the military from families of dissidents who were then killed and were placed in with families of loyal families to the military regime. And these kids were so young, not knowing that they were not with their birth parents, and using DNA, were reunited with relatives. Perhaps one of the most poignant examples of trying to make compensation and restitution after a period of horrendous violence. So If we look at the trials in general, beginning with that were the establishment of which was laid with the Truth Commission report, Nunca Más, victims of human rights abuses were allowed to acquire safety. The military, by and large, stayed in the background under civilian rule, and especially as civilian rule proceeded in the late 90s and 2000s, found a safety that they did not have, even safety to protest the current government that they lacked under the military junta. They had an audience in CONADEP and being able to meet with psychologists and social workers and tell their story, and there was limited accountability. 3,100 people convicted out of perhaps tens of thousands of officers, low-ranking and high-ranking, who were active perpetrators of torture, rape, and murder. There was no allowance, there was no asking questions of perpetrators, there was no apology by the military toward its past crimes, and there was no access to reparations. The idea being of this Truth Commission was that we will trade truth for amnesty early on. We will accept the military's amnesty with the idea of truth trials. All we want is to find out as much information as we can about those disappearances. So a rather imperfect model of restorative justice in terms of meeting the needs of victims. In Rwanda, the genocide that happened in 1994, from April to July of 1994, anywhere from, again, talk about horrific disparity in possible numbers of people who were killed, 800,000 to 1 million Tutsis and Hutus were slaughtered by Hutu, especially extremist Hutus. Unknown numbers were raped, unknown numbers were mutilated but survived, unknown numbers were assaulted. And it was a genocide that was unique in many ways from any other genocide that has existed. One is that most genocides, in fact, I struggle to think of one that doesn't have a governmental component to it. Most genocides are perpetrated by government military security units. This was perpetrated largely by ordinary Rwandans. It was a popular genocide involving hundreds of thousands of offenders. Hundreds of thousands of offenders. Also unusual is that the victims knew one another. In other words, these were localized killings within hamlets, villages, in which neighbors killed one another. So this wasn't military units mass killing of strangers. This was close, and the weapons used meant that not only the victims and offenders know each other, but the weapons used were very primitive. Knives, machetes. In other words, there was no physical distance involved. This wasn't firing squads at a distance. This was up close, personal brutality. The genocide only ended when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, primarily Tutsis, conquered the entirety of the country. And the government that was responsible for organizing the genocide and many of the key perpetrators fled to the Congo. And so what you had then was a new government that had taken power after the genocide. It wasn't like Argentina, where the military shared power, that a guilty military sharing power with a innocent civilian government. This was a completely new government. The old military had fled, but this new government had enormous obstacles in bringing to justice the perpetrators of the genocide. The justice system was literally destroyed in the aftermath of the Civil War. Court buildings were decimated. Judges and attorneys fled. There was no justice system on which to build, especially in any kind of short-term way, a system of trials. Summary executions were considered, but that would just that was deemed immoral by the new government, primarily made up of Tutsis who were victims. That would be immoral, and it might lead to a renewed civil war by Hutu power extremists. So summary executions were not on the table. And certainly amnesty, a blanket amnesty, let's forgive and forget the past and start anew, was unthinkable, given the tremendous, hard to understand suffering of hundreds of thousands of Rwandans who stayed in the country. So what the Rwandan government did, this new post-genocide government, was to resurrect a tradition of Rwanda called Gacha, called justice on the grass. This was a traditional, tribal, informal way of resolving dispute resolutions. And I'll go through what it consists of. when I spell out how it operated after the genocide. So the Rwandan parliament passed Organic Law 42,000 in the year 2000, creating a gachacha system brought to bear not on traditional crimes, which tended to be property crimes, stealing, burglary, that kind of thing, but to rape, property crimes, assault. The first step in this process was to elect 255,000 judges, who were mostly traditional tribal elders from villages across Rwanda. These elections were all adults over 18 could participate. Judges that were elected were given rudimentary legal training on gachacha, so there was some attempt to systematize processes and standards. And each gachacha or council had 19 judges attached to it. Levels of gachacha. You see right below, lowest to highest, there were 9,000 gachacha councils at the neighborhood or cell level scattered throughout Rwanda. Above them, there were 1,500 gachacha councils at, let's say, the province level, or this in this country would be the county level. 154 gachacha councils at the state level or commune level, and then 12 at the prefecture, which is not the national, but one subnational level that combined various provinces. So there was a very grassroots but hierarchical gachacha council process. The second step was in these 9,000 cell gachacha councils to gather testimonies. So gachacha means meat on the grass, justice on the grass. So in every village in Rwanda, villages were encouraged to gather over the space of a couple days and tell about what they saw. What crimes did they witness? Who were the victims? Who was responsible? Who were the perpetrators? Gather these testimonies, the who, what, when, where, in a systematized form. And then, third step, assign the cases, depending on the offense, to the appropriate level of gachacha. So property crimes would be handled at that same 9,000 cell level. Non-lethal assault would be handled by the gachacha councils at the sector level. Murder was handled at the communal gachacha councils, and for those who were organizers, instigators of murder and rape, by the Rwandan National Court System or the United Nations Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So here's what gachacha is, whether it be at the cell level, prefecture level, commune level. It's open space, justice on the grass. You would take each form described a specific alleged crime. The judges would announce the case and ask any individuals who had knowledge of this case could speak. And survivors would give their own testimony or not. And many times a crime was announced, and only the person who originally brought it up could verify, could tell anything about what happened. So the survivors, if they had information, could accuse, explain, and describe. If the accused was present, in many cases the accused had fled the village for understandable reasons, but if the accused was there, could defend themselves and have a chance to confess. After that process of very informal, there was no standard of eyewitness testimony, then the judges decide, and if the accused was there and found guilty, could appeal. So here's the sentencing guidelines given for the crime: if the offender confessed, if the offender did not confess, if the offender confessed, and if the offender confessed and named other people who participated in these kind of crimes with him or her. And 50% of the time, of whatever time given, was spent in prison. The other 50% doing community service like local infrastructure projects, sewers, roads, that kind of thing, community buildings. That's how it worked on paper. In practice, and I don't want to go over all of this just in the interest of time, but I'm happy to have this PowerPoint available to folks. Public opinion surveys were taken various times by American universities, the Rwandan government. The New Times was a Rwandan newspaper, English speaking, the Center for Conflict Management, an international NGO. And you can see that at first in 2000, there was a lot of support for gachacha before it was instituted. A lot of very hopeful ideas of what Gacha would do in terms of reuniting the country, promoting accountability and the like. As you see, while the percentages still remain high to some extent, it begins to decrease once Gacha is implemented in practice, and the shortcomings of Gacha are seen very clearly. And those problems are these. Rwanda is a nation scared of its own shadow. One of the leading human rights activists, Catholic Church father, mentioned, and the aftermath of the genocide. And even though there's a new government in power, witnesses still live in local villages. Victims still live in local villages. Offenders may still live in local villages. So and the government can't protect people in their own houses. And so witnesses very, very much feared retaliation for any kind of testimony. So there was a chilling effect. Syndicates of denunciation existed. The closest I could say I could make to this in our country would be during McCarthyism, where individuals accused other people of being communist, not because they thought they were communists, but because they didn't like them or because they didn't agree with their political opinion. So in Rwanda, after the genocide, neighbors who didn't like each other, maybe they had bad blood predating the genocide. Their animals went on each other's territory. Their in-laws did not get along personally. Would denounce each other and accuse each other of crimes during the genocide. So this was a way of settling scores with enemies. There were, for international human rights organizations like Amnesty International, there were many of these Gacha processes fell short of what international human rights law allowed or required. So those who were accused did not have legal representation. These were these were village gatherings where people just talked. So it wasn't a courtroom, and suspects did not have any lawyers. Judges certainly lacked training and could be biased. These are village elders respected for their wisdom and experience, but they were not judges used to judging cases that involving violence in most cases. And so there was also very different than there was a lack of systematized penalties and standards of evidence across Rwanda. Inconsistency in judging and sentences. There was no real standard of proof. It was left up to the judges, the 19 judges of each Gacha council, on a case-by-case basis. And offenders could be very disruptive in the process. Some of the offenders actually became judges because not all offenders were known. It was only after the fact that some of those who participated in Gacha were told that were discovered in terms of their own crimes against either Hutu themselves or Tutsi if they were Hutu. Offenders also obstructed, lied flat out, stonewalled, refused to admit guilt, given that there may not have been much evidence against them. And many offenders simply fled to other parts of Rwanda or other countries in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So did Gacha meet the needs of victims? Well, Gacha did in many cases with a lot of asterisks, especially fears of retaliation. Victims had an audience. They could ask questions if their offender was there. There was the possibility of accountability, and victims could ask for an apology and in many cases did receive it. After all, there's an incentive in the sentencing guidelines for offenders, if there's evidence against them, to confess and to express remorse. But Gacha survivors often did not acquire safety, and the Rwandan government was way too poor to fund either directly with money or indirectly through in-kind or things that money might buy access to reparations. So here's a quick side-by-side of trials, for example, trials in our own country and the Gacha process. And again, I'll make sure that this PowerPoint is available. Let's go to Vermont right here. Vermont reparative panels. The last statewide figures I could get, and now reparative panels are under community justice centers that are scattered all over Vermont. You'll see them as stars here on the map. So the DOC does collect this data, but I wasn't able to access it remotely. So 2015, 700 volunteers gave 22,000 hours to more than 2,000 cases before something called a Vermont Reparative Panel. These panels began in 1995 when the Vermont Department of Corrections received a grant from the National Department of Justice to have a pilot project. And by 2015, there were more than 2,000 cases in total given to reparative panels. Well, what does that mean? What are reparative panels? Well, reparative panels at Northfield's had one since the late 1990s. We were an early, the early location of them. I've been on the Northfield panel since 2001. There are two ways that offenders can appear before us. One is called pre-adjudication, which means the police encounter a situation. They may or may not believe it's a crime. Even if they believe it's a crime, they don't want to refer it to the state attorney's office because they believe that having a charge on someone's record or going through the trial plea bargaining route just wouldn't be appropriate, can refer a case or an incident directly to a reparative panel, pre-adjudication. Also, second way is post-adjudication. So someone has been found guilty of an offense. Since they've been found guilty, they've taken responsibility for it. So they've pled guilty or admitted guilt. And so it comes to us as part of their probation. So as a way of getting off of probation, they have to meet with a reparative panel. And regardless of if it's pre or post adjudication, the process is the same. So the offender comes to us, and by us meaning a group of citizens in Northfield. Anybody here on the call could become a member of a reparative panel in your community. It takes some training put on by your local community justice center. You meet twice a month. And at these meetings, you would have, first of all, a first meeting with an offender. And at this first meeting, you have 3 or 4 people who look like me, who are just ordinary citizens, volunteers. You would have the offender, and you also, in some cases, have the victim. And the purpose of the first meeting is to engage in a conversation. There's a little bit of a script where, first of all, we want to hear what happened from the offender's own words, from the victim's own words first, then the offender, then any other parties who might be in the room. And the goal is then to identify what the needs are of the various parties and to sign a contract at the end of this meeting where the offender takes steps to understand the harm that he or she has caused, takes steps to make amends to the victim and other affected parties, repairs bonds with the community, because again, the community is often an indirect victim, and then takes steps to avoid doing it again, to avoid recidivism. And they generally have 2 months to fulfill these the ideas or the requirements of the contract. And I do want to emphasize that these are not things that the offender is ordered to do. The offender is part of the conversation and has as much of a voice in saying, no, I can't do that. I don't have the time. I don't have the talents to do that. Can we think of something else? So the offender has complete veto power over what's in the contract. If the system breaks down because the offender, for example, suddenly decides not to take accountability or does not agree to do things that other folks in the room, that's fine. Then we have another way through the formal justice system of taking the case from there. At the second meeting, then, we review what happens. The offender can come, the victim can come back, and we go through the contracts and see what the offender has done. So is this effective? There's been one evidence-based study of reparative panels in Vermont by the Crime Research Group. And the idea was to take groups of offenders who had appeared before a reparative board and those who had gone through the traditional justice system. And if we look at those two groups of pre-adjudication offenders and post-adjudication offenders, the percentage on the left are the recidivism rates of reparative panels. And on the right are recidivism rates for the traditional justice system offenders. So you can see there's pretty good, I can't say that this study is robust as it could have been because there are lots of variables that might make an offender commit a same crime or similar crime again within a certain period of time or not. Reparative panels are only one. It's sought to as much as possible to isolate those variables, but then again, it's a complicated question. The Montpelier Community Justice Center, which I was the chair of the board for 4 years, also does surveys of all the offenders who come before reparative panels in Montpelier, Northfield, and Waterbury. Those are the 3 reparative panels under its jurisdiction. And you can see there were surveys in 2016 and 2019. And the percentages then below that, you can see that's the percentage in 2016 and 2019 that offenders agreed with. So in other words, in 2016, 75% of offenders said in a post-exit survey, I better understand the impact of the crime that I committed. 88% in 2019, and so forth. And then it's my view that these reparative panels do meet, when we have victims, have the potential to meet all 8 A's that victims have, that victims need in the aftermath of crime or other behavior that they've been subjected to. So to conclude, restorative justice is a global, evolving, and varied phenomenon. We looked at examples of Argentina, Rwanda, Vermont. You may be most familiar with South Africa and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As another example, there are 40 truth commissions that have been established, with Argentina being the first one. Zimbabwe, I've been involved with the Zimbabwe government in creating a truth commission for human rights abuses that go back to the founding of the country in 1980, and specifically a genocide that took place in 1983 in the southern part of the country called Matabeleland, where an estimated perhaps 20,000 people were murdered and tens of thousands of women were raped. The problem with this is that the current prime minister of Zimbabwe, was Secretary of the Interior during this genocide in 1983, and so it's a very delicate matter to be involved as a consultant on in these Truth Commission discussions. Oftentimes, from folks who don't understand the restorative process or who only encountered it on paper, it seems like an easy way out. Like the offender just has to come and talk. It's been my experience that restorative justice is harder for many offenders than simply going to a plea bargain in which they're not really involved in talking to anybody except their lawyer, or even if there's a trial, which there hardly is at all in misdemeanor cases, because it forces individuals to be in a room. And even if victims are not there, to be in a room with people like me who are going to ask tough questions of them and what happened. We want to hear from them, and we also want to ask open-ended questions such as, well, who do you think was affected and how? So and then asking them what they believe is appropriate, what they believe is necessary to repair the harm done by their actions, that they take accountability, that they have admitted that they've done. Restorative justice is not for people who say they're innocent, because there's nothing to be held accountable for. That's best achieved through the traditional criminal justice processes. But for those who have said, yes, I did it, it can be a harder way of understanding the consequences of what they did. And a second myth is that it's only appropriate for things like DUI, driving while license suspended, property crimes like vandalism, or bullying. I've been involved in restorative processes for involuntary manslaughter. I've been involved in I will be involved in processes that involve domestic violence victims and offenders. It gets more complicated when you're going beyond low-level offenses, and you need certainly additional training. But it's not something that is automatically reserved for just low-level nonviolent crime. And finally, 3 variables that I've learned over the years: that it's not any outsider's role to decide how justice is best advanced in a community. Justice practices are embedded in every single culture around the world. And there's often not a need for experts whatsoever, as much as maybe somebody to be a catalyst for discussions, so that people can access their own wisdom and their own culture and discuss ways among themselves about how to hold people accountable for even horrific events such as genocide. Second, to keep the needs and identities of victims first and foremost. They're often left out because, especially in Western law, victims are only needed for testimony purposes. And testimony is only allowed in certain areas. So judges will rule some victim's testimony, you can't go there. You can't answer that question. We're not interested in this area. So, and once victims testify, then they're no longer needed anymore. Or restorative justice puts the needs of victims and their participation at the center of the process. And finally, now that, and I appreciate Tim from Maine being here, we've got now a real developing collection of restorative justice processes. Minnesota's been a leader. Vermont's been a leader. New England in general has been a leader. We can teach and learn from other states who are moving away from the traditional model, and especially over incarceration. So let's talk to one another and cross-pollinate. So that's what I've got. Let me see if I can go back to Google Meeting and stop sharing. And go back. There we go. So thank you for your attention and for your interest.
Thank you, Rowley. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
I might just jump in and say one thing more. There's nothing worse than somebody who doesn't know anything, who thinks they know something. But I just want to mention a story that happened to me. In 2010, we visited Rwanda. My daughter was working for the UNHCR, and we stayed in a small village on the eastern edge of Rwanda. And it just happened to be April. It was about 2010. And it was during the anniversary time of the genocide. And it was quite remarkable that it was still an alive process. There were people meeting in all the villages. We had to walk into town, and it was a few miles. And we could see the people still meeting in groups during this week of, I can't remember if what they called a reconciliation or something, or maybe a Gacha. But it was an active process still going on.
Yeah, the last
15 years later. Yeah.
The last Gacha trials were in 2012. Yeah. So it was an 11-year process. Other questions or comments that folks have? Yeah, ACA Freedom Group.
Oh, sorry, I'm under the wrong email there. My name is Lori, and I have a question about whether if I am the victim in a domestic violence assault, whether I have redress by this system, restorative justice in the courts in Vermont, Burlington.
Yeah, so that's I'm on the board of Circle, which used to be Washington County Battered Women's Shelter. So I'm involved in conversations among domestic violence advocates and restorative justice practitioners. There is, I don't know about the Burlington area. I know there's an initiative with the Montpelier Community Justice Center of meeting with male offenders and talking from the offender and having them talk about the harm that they've done and talk about behavior modification and the like. In terms of domestic violence survivors, is there and Lori, correct me if I'm wrong. I hear you asking if you're a survivor, is there a way of entering a restorative justice process with the offender?
Yes.
Right now, to the best of my knowledge, there is certainly nothing systemic, but there might be, if you contact the community justice center closest to you, there might be a way of an individual process. Mm-hmm. If the offender and victim, I would like to, I'm very, very cautious about using this in DV cases. I see it as appropriate, but just for a subset. So that would be the way to go in terms of if there's anything that would be available to you as an individual or someone that you know on a case-by-case basis. I would hope that there would be something systemic for those cases that are appropriate for the system, because I think there's promise in that, but it's got to be so carefully done. And it would involve, of course, meeting with the survivor separately from the offender first intensely, understanding the dynamic, and only after those meetings having them come together in a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Any other questions or comments folks have? Yeah.
If this is Ian Stokes, are you calling on me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with this system. I have heard about restorative justice in Burlington, and I suspect I got it all wrong. The context I heard was that if one, actually in the case that I'm familiar with, if someone has had a bicycle stolen, they can get some kind of a voucher to help them buy a new one. But that sounds as if it's wrong, because restorative justice, from what you've told us, involves a kind of one-on-one victim and perpetrator relationship. So there's not a like.
Just left.
Oh.
Must have pressed the wrong button.
Yeah. He's absolutely right. There are victim compensation programs, and Burlington's probably the most well-funded one. Montpelier had one that was not terribly well-funded, terribly well-known about, and thus not well-accessed. But that's completely separate from any kind of restorative justice initiative. And that certainly tries to address the needs of victims in terms of access to reparations of some kind, but it's not any kind of process. Was that, I didn't get the name of the guy, was that Ian who?
Ian Stokes.
Ian, okay. Ian, are you back on?
Yeah, the connection was dropped, so I'm back on. Yeah, so sorry about that. Not sure how that happened.
No worries. I was just saying that that's a separate program. That's a victim compensation program. And Burlington has, I think, the most robust one that I know of from the community justice centers. But you're absolutely right. That's not a restorative justice initiative. That's just trying to replace for victims immediately what was taken.
Great, thanks. That helps a lot.
Sure.
Hello.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi. I was in Argentina, Buenos Aires, maybe 10 years ago, and every Thursday at the Madre de Plaza de Mayo, people can walk. It's like, you walk around in a circle, and it's in front of the Pink House, which is similar to our White House, and still feeling very unresolved around what has happened, because there's still many, many, many missing children and adults as well. And I'm wondering, do you think, other than maybe people feeling not so alone with the injustices, what was their hope in having something like that, people to go to a sort of protest in front of the president's house, the Pink House?
So are you talking about it in terms of right now or back when they first started it in the 1980s?
No, right now.
Right now, yeah. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo have been often called sort of the conscience of Argentina. These are mothers whose husbands or sons were disappeared during the Dirty War, and they began protesting during the military regime. And talk about an act of courage every Thursday. Now they continue to protest because there was so much still unknown. Time's running out in terms of perpetrators dying, documents having been destroyed, and now even increasing chance of them being misplaced. So it's to call attention to the fact that these are crimes that are still ongoing, because especially, and this gets these sort of technicalities of international human rights law, the United Nations has recognized since 2005 that victims have a right to truth. And what does that mean, a right to truth? Well, it means, according to the United Nations Human Rights Council, that victims have a right to know what happened to them or their loved ones. That's a fundamental right enshrined in human rights law that can be justiciable, that courts can rule on. And so they call attention to the fact that this is a right denied to tens of thousands of Argentinians. So it's to keep pressure on the civilian government and its judicial apparatus to keep prosecuting when they find perpetrators and they find evidence.
So other than civilians, do you think that they are taking it seriously?
Well, so it's complicated, right? We talk about in the United States, for example, with being in Afghanistan and Iraq, that there's sort of war fatigue or battle fatigue that the civilian populace has if they've been engaged in a conflict for so long. The same might be said of Argentina. There's sort of dirty war fatigue. And as distance separates the date of the crimes from the present, there are other priorities that civilian judicial apparatus has to deal with. The economy certainly has been in a roller coaster, so funding priorities. Perpetrators have died, so they can't be brought to justice. So they play a critical role to the extent that they can, being a famous interest group, the conscience of the country, to try to keep pressure to say, hey, I know it's been a long time. And some folks may just want to forget the past at this point. Or some folks may think that we have other things we need to worry about as a country, or my state prosecutor has something else to worry about in terms of crime. But for us, this is still an ongoing, damaging occurrence. And we won't rest until we find some sort of answer, given that we have this right to truth.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. I'm so glad that you were able to see this in person, because I can only imagine. How did you feel witnessing this? And did you know the context of it when you saw it?
I did. My son-in-law is Argentinian. And so when I was there for a month to visit his country, he took my daughter and myself there. And so I had been an advocate in the domestic violence movement. So the two of us walked. I can't even think of what I want to use. But anyway, we walked the perimeter of this circle, and it was very heart-wrenching to think that there were still many families who have never been reunited. And those that are being reunited now, when they were taken as children, are now adults. And so they're being reunited with family members that they have never known. Just thinking about it now, I get a little weepy just thinking about, all those years lost and wondering what happened to your child. How do you reconcile with that? I mean, it's just, I can't imagine. It's beyond, I can't fathom that kind of, atrocity that happens. So, I mean, I was glad I went, but I have to say it's never left me. It was pretty profound.
That, in my mind, that is one of the most insidious crimes of the junta, and it also blurs the boundary between victims and perpetrators. So the families who raised these kids knew that they were not their own kids and knew that they were probably kids of dissidents, gave them, in many cases, very loving homes, raised them, and for 40, 50 years of this person's life, believed that they were their real parents and loved them as their real parents. And until they were told via DNA that, no, you're not related to these folks anymore. And imagine in that situation, then, let's say you may or may not have knowledge of your own parents, real parents, considering depending on how old you were when you were taken away from them. But then the complicated relationship you have with your parents who raised you, who might be complicit on one end, but also parents on another end. It's the moral dilemmas involved in that are so acute.
Yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah. Good point that you raise.
That many of us are parents, right? And gosh. Tim, let me ask you, how were you able to observe these Gacha processes up close, and did you have an interpreter? Were they in English in some cases?
No. They were not. They were just. We were there for 2 weeks, just visiting our daughter, and so it was just we were total outsiders. Yeah.
Okay.
It was a very rural area, so it was way out in the sticks
Yeah.
on Lake Kigali. Yeah.
Other comments or questions?
In Afghanistan, if the government and the Taliban ever reconcile or come to a peace agreement, do you foresee there being some sort of truth commission there to, even though they might have war fatigue?
I would not. I would think that would not be a likely. Not be likely in the short term, because the Taliban in particular has been complicit in so many crimes against innocent people in Afghanistan. Not that the government's forces have been blameless, but it hasn't been a sort of everybody's responsible, so we can meet on an equal playing field kind of thing. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure the Taliban is really interested in a peace agreement that doesn't give it control in some way. I never want to say that the thing that I've learned about truth commissions, which is completely, truth commissions are only as good as the legislation or statute that creates them. And that statute that creates them is a result of compromises based on the relative power levels of the competing powers. So if there was a truth commission, the Truth Commission can be gamed in all sorts of ways. If there's a complicit interest group that has predominant power in creating, can decide what crimes the Truth Commission might look into, what dates, whether their own party will be looked into or not, or exempt. For example, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The African National Congress said, yeah, we'll participate, but we don't want anybody in our party being investigated because this was an apartheid crime. And whatever violence we did, including terrorism, was justified. So the most effective truth commissions are those, and Argentina is a good example of one that wasn't created very well because of the relative power of the military, are when there is a relative level playing field of the parties involved that broker an agreement for whatever incentives they have to broker this agreement. And they realize then that we really have a common interest in uncovering as much as possible what we can from the past.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Also, is restorative justice in Vermont work at all with vulnerable populations, such as like elderly abuse kinds of cases?
Not, to the best of my knowledge, so if we talk about like senior citizens in particular, not in particular in terms of as a specific group that is part of the process as the group, but as individuals. For example, if a senior was financially taken advantage of by somebody, that case, if it's reported to the state's attorney, might be referred to a restorative justice process. So there are avenues for elderly people to be involved in the process on a case-by-case basis, but to the best of my knowledge, not any specific restorative justice initiative targeted just at senior citizens.
Thanks.
Sure, you're very welcome.
So you mentioned South Africa, and actually I was wondering why South Africa wasn't included in the countries that you're going to be talking about. And so I was pleased that you brought them up. Are you finding that people are finding it less than satisfactory what they're getting out of the Truth and Reconciliation that they've provided? Is that it's not as robust, and it's not as positive as we have read or heard here?
Yeah, it's my experience with Americans, and I consider myself as one, right, that we prefer happy endings. And so we want to believe that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is like an international model for how two sides who were at war with one another could sit down, Desmond Tutu as the chair, and an incredible man, can get together, talk about stories, settle on a common narrative about the past, and then rebuild the country. And the problem is that two things happened that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not responsible for, but prevented any kind of national reconciliation. One is that the African National Congress became corrupt from the very beginning, that individuals took advantage of their positions in power to not press for true democratization and to not press for cross-cutting parties where, for example, the African National Congress still portrays itself as the liberationist party rather than a party of South Africans that anybody can feel comfortable in joining. And after Nelson Mandela, the elites in the country, understandably, as many elites do, look out for their own interests rather than the interests of building a truly post-racial country. And that kept alive the victimhood, illegitimate as it is, of white South Africans who felt that they were now the victims of Black tyranny. The second thing that didn't happen, and there are complicated reasons for this, is that survivors did not get reparations. There was no fundamental redistribution of land. There was no fundamental redistribution of wealth. There was no fundamental redistribution of economic opportunities, except for the top elite. And we can understand this in this country, too, in terms of the legacy of the 1960s civil rights movement was great for educated African Americans, was great for educated white women. But in terms of those people of color in poverty, left behind by a post-1970s political system and economic system in the United States to a large degree. So the fact that there was no, and this would have been very touchy subject, you're talking about land redistribution under some kind of either willing seller, willing buyer basis, or some kind of gently, transparently done through the court system expropriation. But the fact that then survivors are left with, we were victimized by apartheid and we still remain as poor as we ever have been, simply allowing ourselves to tell our story and to say, for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to give us psychological services and say, thank you for your testimony, was never enough. So I didn't bring the TRC up because it's complicated. It's a longer story. And also being the more well-known of the Truth Commissions. I wanted to bring up examples that folks may not be familiar with. But you're right, Rachel.
I wasn't being critical. I was just, and what you've just said really helps provide more information. So thank you for that.
Sure, you're very welcome. And it's not to say the TRC did not do good things. It did a great job of gathering testimony, traveling around the country, holding hearings in indigenous languages, having a safe environment in terms of the chairs would be in a circle, so it wouldn't be a courtroom like. People could see each other. They tried to be as victim friendly as they could with the structure. And the testimony produced about crimes under apartheid was absolutely necessary to uncover. So there's a lot of good that the TRC did. But understanding that victims need, if victims need reparations, that we need to make sure that apartheid is not only dead, but that there is apartheid had an economic component that was never dismantled, with the exception of allowing a new Black elite into corporate and political offices. So I think actually, according to public opinion polls, the TRC was much more popular outside of South Africa than inside South Africa, among all groups surveyed. Any other questions or comments? Jane, I'm really appreciative of the time this afternoon together.
Well, we're really appreciative of your time with us. It's been just very interesting and thought-provoking, for sure. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I included Vermont because if any of you want to volunteer at your local community justice center and be part of restorative justice, it's completely accessible, evening hours. The pay is incredible because you don't have to deal with a W-2 or anything because you don't get paid. So it's very simple. in that way.
Great. And could I come see how it works?
Yeah,
I'd love
absolutely.
to do that. Okay, I found your email address, so I'll be in touch.
That sounds great, Tim.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Be
Thanks
well.
so much.
Have a very good rest of the afternoon.
You too.